I want to ask a question here, and I heard you. I think you answered this question on Daniel Thorson's Emerge podcast, which is excellent podcast, excellent interview. And I'm looking at this evolution, this growing up of cultures of civilization, and I could very much see like the move from the traditional to the what comes after traditional, modern. Is that right?
Modern. Yeah.
So you go from the role-based identity to the individualization. You go from sort of like traditional America to like the I generation, right? To the iPod and the iMe and all the rest. And then you have this emergence into postmodern, which is that's where you're getting into more like a ethnocentric thinking. Is that right? Where you're kind of thinking more like
the
Go ahead.
Ethnocentric is, so there's a couple stages below traditional. I'm not starting at the beginning. There's survival, magical, power dominance, and then traditional. And in general, we all go through that as a being, but and we've gone through those as civilizations. But traditional kind of is where, if you look around our culture, there's still a lot of people living a very traditional mindset, and it's characterized by black and white thinking, us against them. It's the ethnocentric realm of existence, which my group is superior to your group. That's where we get racism and things. Mm-hmm. I don't want you contaminating our genes. It's an ethnocentric way of seeing the world.
So this is what I'm pointing to then, because I'm thinking about the modern rise, as, again, referring back to the Emerge podcast, the modern rise towards social justice ideals and equality and all the rest in culture, in our civilization, which is excellent. That's good. Let's have that. And yet the people who are often the loudest at championing it are people who are very much acting in almost the exact opposite way that they're proposing to trying to create, with an us them and violent response and shunning and cruelty and this sort of like, don't contaminate our ideological gene pool with your differences. So what can you talk about that for a second before we get back into the growing up individually?
That's a complicated dynamic. So I'll have to explain postmodernism a little bit first, because what you're describing is what I call dysfunctional postmodernism. So once you move out of traditional thing, into modern individuation, it's actually extremely humbling a process. Anyone who's over 30 who hasn't made $1 million or become the star guitar player they've always wanted to be is usually humbled by life. It's not turned out the way they were hoping. By the time you're 30 or 35, there's a certain kind of humbling that goes on. You kind of know your place in the world, and you kind of know what your skill levels are to other people. You're not the Olympian, or you're not the best guitar player, but you're going to accept that that's who you are and make a good life. And that humbling process really sets us up nicely for the postmodern kind of disposition, which is to be really sensitive and accepting of other people and how they are in the world. And the other dynamic that happens is that you've expressed your individuality and it's lonely. You've left your group, and you want to connect with other people like yourself. And so in my life, I connected with the Buddhist geeks and the integral community, because I was into Buddhism and I was kind of geeky. I was liking technology. I was a computer programmer. So there was a whole group of people that I could relate to that were very different than my family that I'd grown up with. And so I really started wanted to connect with those people. Now, when you meet people like yourself, so, do you have an experience where you individuated and then looked for people like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I efforted quite hard to to become my own person and like blaze a trail with my career and all the rest. And then it occurred to
Your
me that
interest in ethnogens?
Yeah, exactly. And then eventually, I mean, I have met many different colleagues and stuff around that time, but in regards to like the living my life day in, day out, the people I surround myself with, I realized at some point that none of what I was doing made any benefit whatsoever to anybody, like maybe on some larger scale perhaps, but not in my personal life and not in the people I care most about if I wasn't involved in a active community of some variety. So I think I got to a point where I realized like how valuable and important it was for me to feel like I belong with people I care about and who care about me, and that we are collectively making efforts towards putting into these relationships in a way that those relationships will hold us for the duration of our lives, and also will be the sort of the net that new generations can step into, because a net of integrity and like good, healthy relating and all the rest. So, I mean, I definitely got to the place where I was like, yeah, all this awesome world traveling and like psychedelic taking and mind blowing and all the rest is all well and good, but now I feel incredibly alienated and isolated from other people because I'm not like in sync with others around me, but I don't want to jeopardize what I've accomplished to go into a group that I don't fit with. So then there was an effort towards like contributing and living with other people in a way that sort of we all are learning and co-creating and co-learning together into healthy belonging.
You sound like you've got a very conscious, like explicitly conscious group about group dynamics and support, which is really beautiful and rare. And I just want to ask, did you just randomly pick people off the street to join that little collective with you?
No, the circumstances of life put me into a series of choices, and as I followed what felt best for those choices, I ended up in a place that unexpectedly presented a group of people who had already been working towards a certain way of being in the world that I really connected with. Right. Yeah.
And so you resonated deeply with their values.
Yeah, that's a much simpler way of putting it. Yeah. But also well, as accurate.
Really, yeah. And that's what it's about, is that you want to find people like you and connect deeply with them. And the interesting thing is, like, how do you connect deeply with somebody that you're meeting? Right? Do you do it by studying a physics text or a computer book or talking philosophy? Or do you say, how do you feel about that? Right? If you want to get to know someone deeply, you say, how are you feeling? What do you think about that? What's your reaction to that? You're starting to explore the inner landscape of another person. And that's why feelings, which is what I'm talking about, like feelings and emotions, start becoming important only at a postmodern level of development. Prior to that, feelings and emotions get in the way of functioning. When you're in modern stages, they interfere with your ability to function, because if you're too sensitive to everything going around you, you'll get overwhelmed by feelings and you'll shut down. And if you're in a role, oriented traditional structure and you're having feelings, they get in the way of your role. So it's really only at postmodernism that feelings have a function, and they're needed for you to bond and get to know someone deeply. And that's where you start really connecting deeply with somebody else, and you form those deep communities. There was a context that we were doing this.
Yeah, you're moving towards explaining dysfunctional postmodernism in regards to the social justice warrior culture, which yes. I mean could point to also towards like the alt-right culture, but alt-right isn't pretending to be about social justice while seemingly operating in the opposite way.
Right. And so what I think happens is that we've got young kids, in my eyes young, in their early 20s, going to university, who are really developmentally either at a kind of traditional or modern stage of development, but they're being given the rhetoric of postmodernism without really earning it. So they've got the values and the vision from a group of people that they haven't earned. They haven't been humbled by their modern individuality. And they still have this ethnocentric, us against them kind of leaning towards seeing the world. It's just the way their cognitive structures are. And so they take on the cause of postmodernism with an ethnocentric proselytation and kind of vehemence, which includes us against them kind of thinking. And so in that world, it's okay to attack the people who aren't like you. Mm-hmm. So I really see the dysfunctional social justice warrior as like people trying to step into a stage of development that they're not actually mature enough to be embodying yet. And you can see, if you look online, there are some social justice warriors who talk about their growing up story and how they see what they were doing was wrong and inappropriate, because they finally got there. They finally get that when you're actually at a functional modernism, you don't act like an ethnocentric gang trying to get rid of the other gang. You find ways to communicate and ways to live together. You don't want to stamp them out.
I mean, those people might be at risk of being hashtag canceled, though, if they don't continue to agree with the younger Twitter generation. But yeah, I find that I find that to be pretty interesting to think about. I mean, here in Canada, a really great sort of case example would be the resistance to Jordan Peterson. And I mean, I don't agree with everything the guy says, you know, and I can see how there's some excellent room for criticism about his ideals, and yet some of the responses were just brutal. And then recently, with his daughter coming out talking about how the medication he was prescribed, benzodiazepine, to deal with anxiety, when the anxiety around his wife's terminal cancer diagnosis became so intense, the doctors upped his dose. And as he continued to take it as prescribed, it had a paradoxical response where taking more caused anxiety and taking less caused withdrawal. He went through a series of issues, ends up in Russia trying to detox, with pneumonia, almost dying in the ICU for months. Finally is starting to recover. His daughter shares the story online, and all these so-called liberal, leftist, social justice people are like, good, he deserves it. Fuck him. He deserves his addiction. He deserves his pain, you know? Yeah. And it's like, those are the people who are proposing to be leading the way for a better life for our whole civilization. And I think it's just...
And you can see the ethnocentric gang mentality of dominating and destroying the enemy. And unfortunately, it's hard to do anything about it, because that is how they see the world. That's literally their developmental and neuronal complexity is still too simplistic to catch the nuances of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so difficult to talk across value structures, because the people in the higher levels have the neuronal complexity to deal with anything lower than them, but the people at lower levels cannot comprehend the perspective of the people at higher developmental levels.